Welcome to each one of you as you join us this afternoon for our seminar, Difficult Texts Regarding the Jews in Matthew's Gospel, a Socio-Political Framework, to be presented this afternoon by Sister Celia Deutsch via recording. And welcome also to Father Chris Monaghan, who will introduce a little bit more formally later in the program. So today I'm on the land originally inhabited by the Yalukit Willam people of the Kulin Nation, which is now cared for by the Wurundjeri people. And as we gather, we pay our respects to the peoples who originally inhabited and cared for the various lands on which we are located today, and to their elders past, present and emerging, as we work with them towards justice, peace, healing and reconciliation. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of the timetable and program for today, shortly our presentation will be introduced by Sister Patricia Watson, a sister of Our Lady of Sion. After the presentation, there'll be a pause for reflection before we hear a response from Father Chris Monaghan. And then following this short second input session, there'll be time for discussion in our breakout rooms. And finally, an opportunity for Father Chris to respond to some of your questions. So Patricia, I now ask you to introduce Sister Celia and her presentation, please.
Thank you, Carmel. So I'm delighted to introduce Sister Celia Deutsch as our guest speaker to address the topic, Difficult Texts Regarding the Jews in Matthew's Gospel, a socio-political framework. Celia is a sister of Our Lady of Sion, American by nationality, living in Brooklyn, New York, and has been there for many years. After entering the congregation, Celia completed her theological studies, leading to a doctorate at the University of Toronto, Canada in 1985. Her thesis was Hidden Wisdom and the Easy Yoke, Wisdom, Torah, and Discipleship in Matthew, chapter 11, verses 25 to 30. Since then, Celia has taught scripture in New York, where she was a lecturer of both Jewish and Christian students. She continues at Barnard as a research scholar in the Department of Religion. Excuse me. Celia has published widely on related topics, stressing always the integral relationship of Judaism and Christianity. Currently working on a commentary on Matthew for the Wisdom Commentary series, Liturgical Press, Celia is also engaged in Jewish-Christian Muslim relations in a variety of contexts, teaching also at Holy Trinity College, Harare, Zimbabwe, as part of the congregation's partnership with this college. I'm sure you'll appreciate Celia's wealth of biblical knowledge, the clarity of her presentation, and her understanding of the complexity of Matthew's context. So I'm happy to present Celia to you now.
Good evening. It is good to be with you. I would like to thank Patricia Watson for her gracious introduction and the Jewish-Christian Relations team of the Sisters of Sion for their kind invitation. I'd also like to thank Mark Welch for technical assistance and stimulating conversation in preparation of this paper. The general theme of my presentation is difficult texts regarding the Jews in Matthew's Gospel, a socio-political framework. I'll focus on the ways in which Matthew's Gospel both reflects his social and political reality, and then conversely creates it, constructs it. In other words, Matthew's text comes out of a community, and it also helps to construct the community. I've chosen to focus on what is perhaps the most difficult verse in Matthew, the blood curse. Let's look at the text. So when Pilate So he could do nothing, but rather the riot was beginning. He took some water and washed his hands before the crowd and saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. Then the whole people, pastalaos, answered, his blood be on us and on our children. So he released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. We'll read this verse in the context of chapter 27, verses 15 to 26, and then later on in the woes against the scribes and Pharisees, especially chapter 23, verses 29 to 39, with its condemnation of the scribes and Pharisees for killing the prophets, the calling down of the innocent blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, and the prophecy of Jerusalem's destruction. The material brings chills, remembering as we do that such language has through the centuries been used to legitimate anti-Semitic attitudes, as well as legal measures and violence against Jews. As early as the middle of the 2nd century, Justin, in his first apology, associates the destruction of Jerusalem and the conquest of Judea as, quote, punishment for the death of Jesus, unquote. In the mid-3rd century, Origen links the destruction specifically to Matthew 27:25. And you can see this in his commentary on Matthew, which is somewhere in the 240s. As I was preparing for this presentation, I kept thinking of the saying that we used to toss back and forth as kids: sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. I think that's prevalent in a lot of English-speaking cultures, and we know today how wrong it is. Words literally hurt. Words cause. Words are reality. They are not simply sounds. They are performative, as speech act theory tells us. Is the language this bad? It's worse. Like John and other New Testament and then early Christian writers, Matthew deploys the harsh oppositional rhetoric that appears in the prophetic literature, and then even more sharply in the apocalyptic texts of the Second Temple period. The sectarians behind the Qumran text call themselves the sons of light, and all other Jews the sons of darkness. The Jewish context of the eastern end of the Mediterranean is situated even more broadly in the context of the whole empire, in which the norms of Greco-Roman rhetoric prevailed. Insults flew. So who is Matthew, and who is his audience, and who is the opposition? Matthew's a Jew living at the end of the 1st century, sometime after the fall of Jerusalem, possibly as late as the year 100. Like so many of his contemporaries living in the homeland, including Jesus himself, he's probably multilingual, with Aramaic as his first language and Hebrew the language of prayer and study. He writes in Greek, and he probably speaks Greek as well, since most people of that period did speak Greek. He uses a Greek form of the Hebrew scriptures, very close to the Septuagint, a collection that included what many came to call the apocryphal or deuterocanonical texts, the Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, 1st through 4 Maccabees, Tobit, Judith, etc. And he knows other traditions, some very close to early rabbinic or Tannaitic texts. He's not a rabbi, okay? And the rabbinic movement is just a warning. So I would not say, does he know these texts? That's too clear an answer for this. But he certainly knows some of the traditions that some of them know and reflect. Matthew uses all the sources at his disposal: Jesus traditions, Jewish scriptures, Second Temple literature and post-biblical sources, apocalyptic literature, some proto-rabbinical material. He uses all of this to interpret the story of Jesus, to transmit Jesus's teaching and form his community. He is a man of my friend Claudia Setzer, whom actually I just spoke to about an hour ago, and who has worked on this text. She says that Matthew is a man of ferocious creativity. And I think that's a perfect description. He's an apocalyptic thinker. He either knows texts like 4th Ezra and 1st Enoch and 2nd Baruch, or he knows traditions common to them. To say that he is an apocalyptic thinker means that he looks at the world with an expectation that the present social order, both social and cosmic, is fast coming to an end. He believes that God is going to bring this present order to an end, intervening in ways that will transform it, upending things so that the mighty are put down from their thrones and the lowly are lifted up. The earth bears fruit and justice will reign. The apocalyptic thinking includes, in many traditions, and for Matthew, a Messiah, a Christos, an anointed one, Mashiach. Matthew believes that Jesus was son of David as Messiah, like many Jewish thinkers. He does not, however, believe that this anointed one was, or in his return will be, a military or even a political leader. Matthew takes up an earlier title, Son of Man, and uses it, as well as Mashiach, to speak of Jesus. Thus, Jesus is not only the earthly anointed one who will lead the people in righteousness, but the embodiment of the heavenly figure who will save God's suffering people and represent them before the enthroned God. Take a look, if you want, at Daniel chapter 7, at the figure of the Son of Man there, that Matthew actually quotes verbatim. Matthew's not the only person to bring together these two understandings, Son of Man and Anointed One. The first Enoch similarly does this, makes this move. And so Jesus represents the kingdom of God that Matthew also calls, or prefers to call, the kingdom of heaven, with heaven being a circumlocution for God's name. And that circumlocution is very common in early rabbinic sources, although not later rabbinic sources. This is another apocalyptic category. Matthew lives in the socio-political context of another kingdom, the kingdom of the Caesar. So the kingdom of heaven is juxtaposed in, or I should say, in contradistinction to the reign of Caesar, the kingdom of Caesar. Matthew lives in the wake of 70 with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, the destruction of much of Judea and actually all the way up into Galilee, the enslavement of many of the upper classes and their transport to Rome, the social disruption of so much of Judean and Galilean life. All of this is Matthew's reality and the reality of his community. There's a further disruption, the disruption of his symbolic universe, with the temple as the sign of God's presence in a particular way, the sign of the people's place in the order of things, the pole of the universe. All of that is gone. Matthew and his community, like all Jews, lives in a state of collective trauma. And trying to figure out what does it all mean, Jesus becomes the center of Matthew's symbol system. Jesus is the reality through which Matthew and his community interpret history, their experience, and the very Torah itself. Well, what about that community? As I said, they live at the eastern end of the Mediterranean. They likely live in an urban setting. Why do I say this? It's a place where Greek is spoken and where a scholar like Matthew could have access to the written texts necessary for his work. A place large enough to include more than one form of Jewish community. It's a community also with Gentiles in its numbers, and a community that's trying to sort out what's their place in our midst. All of these people, ethnic Jews as well as Gentiles, who have come into this Jesus Jewish community, are Torah observant, but they are Torah observant according to the interpretations ascribed to Jesus by Matthew and to the teachers in his community. Teachers he says are sent by Jesus, who is God's embodied wisdom. Matthew's community is engaged in a complex, threefold debate, conversation, struggle. You can figure it how you will. He is engaged in a debate with people inside the community who dispute his teaching, with Jewish teachers from another group that he usually calls the Pharisees or the scribes and Pharisees. And there is always the forces of the Roman Empire in sight, or the reality, I should say, of the Roman Empire in sight. As for other Jewish teachers, with whom Matthew is also in debate, these are teachers like Yochanan ben Zakkai and his disciples, and then later Rabbi Akiva and his followers. All of these people fighting with one another, and Matthew is fighting as every bit as hard as anybody else. They are struggling to provide new interpretations of Torah in a post-destruction land. So he lives in a conflict situation, and it's a particular kind of conflict. Matthew and his community, like so many of his fellows, are sectarian Jews. Shia Cohen's definition in his book From the Maccabees to the Mishnah, the last edition, is useful here. He says, and he writes about a variety of Second Temple Jewish groups, saying, a sect is a small organized group that separates itself from a larger religious body and asserts that it alone embodies the ideals of the larger group because it alone understands God's will. Cohen notes that law and scriptural interpretation are focal points of emerging Jewish sects. And I think I find Cohen's definition and description really helpful in thinking about Matthew and so much having to do with first century followers of Jesus. As for the Roman Empire, the Romans are still in the homeland. The soldiers are still there. The tax collectors are still collecting taxes for the Roman Empire. There's the same need, greater need than ever before, to live in ways that do not repeat the recent destruction. Let's turn back to our text. It is part of chapter 27 with its trial scene before Pilate. The chief priests and the elders of the people in Matthew's gospel have met. They've deliberated. They've decided to put Jesus to death, and they've taken him to Pilate. They have handed him over to Pilate. Matthew uses the word paradidomi, which also means to betray. It's interesting, that word means to betray. It means to hand over. It also is the word that's used in talking about handing on a tradition. So for example, in the rabbinic chain of tradition, it's the equivalent of handing over. Matthew chapter 11, verses 25 to 30 uses the word for Jesus, the handing on of knowledge about who Jesus is. This verse is immediately followed by verses 3 to 10 by the account of the death of Judas. In the canonical Gospels, the story is found only in Matthew's Gospel. Judas returns the 30 pieces of silver, the blood money, to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. Haima athoan. The word athoan, innocent, is found in the New Testament only here and in Pilate's self-declaration in verse 24, immediately preceding the people's curse. The chief priests and the elders take the blood money. They purchase a field in which to bury foreigners, which is still called, Matthew says, still called in his day, the field of blood. Innocence and blood. The pericope sets two of the major themes that frame the blood curse of verse 25. Matthew returns to the Markan Passion narrative with Jesus standing before the governor. The governor asks, are you the king of the Jews? Matthew rarely uses the word Jews. This is very unlike John's gospel. It is an outsider's word, and he is an insider. He is a son of Israel. With the sole exception of chapter 28, verse 15, another Matthew story, he uses Jew only as part of the title King of the Jews and always on the lips of Gentiles. So you can see it in chapter 2, verse 2, chapter 27, verse 11, verse 29, and verse 37. So the Magoi, the Magi, Pilate's soldiers, and finally that sign up on the cross. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. With some variation, all four Gospels include that sign, all agreeing on the phrase King of the Jews. The synoptic tradition is unanimous in recounting Jesus's response. You have said so. Matthew 27, verse 11. Pilate has called Jesus King of the Jews. It is not a title or function that Jesus claims for himself, just as he does not claim the title Messiah. His response in this verse being ambivalent. You have said it. Matthew's variation with the demonstrative pronoun this, hutos, is emphatic. It reminds his audience of Jesus and the reign, the kingdom of heaven, and the price of that kingdom. The irony of the sign which bears the offense for which Jesus is executed. Is that the title used by the representatives of the Roman Empire, who alone have the power of exercising capital punishment? Jesus is dying as an accused revolutionary, recalling other self-proclaimed or popularly acclaimed messianic figures such as Judah the Galilean, much earlier in the 1st century. Matthew continues following Mark. He introduces Barabbas, or Jesus Barabbas, if we follow some of the early manuscripts. And I think it's likely that was in the original Matthew, and most of us do at this point. Again, following Mark, he comments that at the festival, the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted. And they had then a notorious prisoner, a desmion episimon called Jesus Barabbas. Literally, Jesus, son of the Father. Is this a real name? Is it an ironic name? I don't know. It could be either. While it is known, however, that Romans sometimes did release prisoners, there is no reference to the governor of Judea doing this customarily at Passover. But Matthew follows the Markan tradition about a custom of Passover prisoner release. However, he introduces and specifies the target group, the crowd, ha'aklos, which is the favorite Matthew's Matthean term. Anthony Salderini describes the crowds this way. He says, the crowds are anonymous, shifting, unstructured, and are thus contrasted with Jesus's disciples, who are a constant group, committed to Jesus and given special instruction. The crowds are portrayed as fundamentally friendly, but also unreliable. Mark, also has the crowd in the scene. They are active, however. They ask Pilate to follow the customs. Matthew, though, omits this detail and has the crowd gathered, while Pilate asks them, "Whom do you want me to release for you? Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called Messiah?" Here he has changed Mark's the King of the Jews. The crowd is no longer friendly, and Matthew's skillful editing emphasizes this fact. Matthew then introduces another character, Pilate's wife. She sends word telling him, "Have nothing to do with that innocent man." Now, innocent is the way the New Revised Standard Version translates it. The Greek has dikaios, righteous, and that's a really important word. So I would prefer to use here something like, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man. For today I have suffered a great deal because of a dream about him." That's in verse 19. The story appears to be a kind of midrashic narrative, like some of the material in the infancy narratives, which is the only other place in Matthew where dream visions occur. They always bear instruction about the visionary's actions in relation to Jesus and Jesus's fate. Think about Joseph. Think about the Magi. There's much to be said about Pilate's wife in later literature. All sorts of narratives get, in sort of novellas, ancient novellas, get created around her. And that's understandable. She's a mysterious figure in the text. We don't even know her name. And so it's logical that we say, well, who is she? And that stories get woven around her. For our purposes, we note that it is another literary move on Matthew's part to underscore Jesus's righteousness, divinely revealed this time to a Gentile, and the guilt of his opponents, the Jewish opponents. It also serves to blur the edges around Pilate's own responsibility. The story unfolds. Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus killed. In verse 20, the tension mounts with chief priests, the often friendly crowds asking for Barabbas, the notorious prisoner, over against the righteous Jesus. Again, Matthew adds to Mark's account by inserting, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Mark does not have the response, Barabbas. Matthew's editing heightens the tension yet again, focusing on the role of the chief priests, the elders, and the crowds in the decision that follows. Matthew follows this with an edited version of Mark. "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" Changing Mark's "the man whom you call the King of the Jews" again. Matthew is emphasizing Jesus's identity as Messiah, hearkening back to the very beginning of the gospel, which reads, "An account of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham." We have in chapter 27, the revolutionary Jesus Barabbas over against Jesus Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Those gathered respond to Pilate's question with, "Let him be crucified," to which Pilate responds, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." Matthew's Pilate is backed into a corner. His wife has told him of a revelatory dream. Gentiles, as well as Jews in the ancient world, believed in dream visions and were respectful of the messages conveyed because they were thought to represent divine instruction. The man is innocent, righteous, according to divine revelation, even to this Gentile. Pilate is to have nothing to do with him. And so he hands the responsibility back to the crowd and those provoking them. And then there is a threat of a riot, an uprising, an uproar, thorubos. Riots and uprisings are a sensitive matter for the Roman Empire of the first century. Throughout the Mediterranean, the order of things was threatened by sporadic unrest. Actually, the first century before Jesus's birth, before the Common Era, was a time of civil war in Rome. Such unrest included the Jewish homeland. Matthew's Pilate needs to appease a crowd threatening to get out of hand. And so he washed his hands before the crowd, saying, I am innocent, atheos. Remember back in the early part of this chapter where Judas talks about innocent blood. He says, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves in verse 24. It is a statement filled with irony. Jesus is the one whose blood is innocent. Judas says, here Pilate declares himself innocent. We wonder if Matthew has forgotten that Pilate is the only one who could proclaim the death sentence. Perhaps in his eagerness to ascribe responsibility to the crowds, chief priests and elders, Matthew overlooks the irony of his narrative move. Pilate washes his hand, enacting his innocence. And this is really important. It's words and gestures can enact a reality. And Pilate is not simply washing his hands, he's enacting his innocence. Matthew here is drawing on earlier biblical traditions, such as Psalm 26, verse 6. I wash my hands in innocence and go round your altar, O Lord. Or Psalm 73, verse 13. All in vain I have kept my heart clean and washed my hands in innocence. In a juridical context, in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 1 to 9, we see described the elders washing their hands over the body of a slain heifer as part of an oath of innocence in the case of a murder where the corpse is found in a field and the identity of the murderer is unknown. The elders' words conclude in verse 8, chapter 21, verse 8 of Deuteronomy. Do not let guilt for the blood of the innocent remain in the midst of your people, Israel. Pilate, this is again another irony, is Pilate declaring and enacting his innocence even as he hands over the innocent one, the righteous one, to be crucified. And we wonder yet again, has Matthew actually forgotten who the historical Pilate was? A man whose bloodthirstiness and whose cruelty was described by Josephus, the Jewish historian, and then much earlier by Pilate's contemporary, Philo of Alexandria. Pilate was ruthless. He was also clever. He held power for 10 years. And the governors of Judea did not last that long, usually. Pilate and Caiaphas reigned together for 10 years before finally the Romans decided to get rid of him. He had become too ruthless, too careless, too reckless. The tension mounts in chapter 27, and it comes to a climax with the response of, quote, all the people. It is shifted now. It is no longer the crowd, but the whole people, pastoral. His blood be on us and on our children. The phrase, the whole people, makes clear who is guilty of shedding Jesus's blood. As Setzer says, it is halaus, pas halaus, all the people. Does Matthew mean the entire Jewish people? After all, there were anywhere from 4 million to 7 million Jews. We don't know exactly how many, scattered throughout the empire and beyond, from Spain to North Africa, from Egypt to Iraq, all the way to the Ukraine. No, Matthew is not thinking of all the Jews everywhere. Some would say that he is thinking of the people as both the Jews in Jerusalem, both the inhabitants and those there for the festival who support Jesus's execution, in the words of Saldarini. Matthew's skillful editing has shifted the responsibility of Jesus's death from Pilate to the leaders and people of Jerusalem, who, according to his version, twice call for Jesus to be crucified. Here, Saldarini notes, his usage resembles Josephus's use of ta plethos, the multitude, for those in Jerusalem who finally instigated the uprising in Jerusalem that gave rise to the Civil War. Moreover, he thinks not only of the death of Jerusalem, but of that generation still in the future when Jerusalem will be destroyed. Blood, innocent blood. Matthew's use of the word is pivotal. It is also particular to his usage in chapter 27. It echoes an earlier text. And we take a look at this text. Matthew 23, verse 29 to 31, and then 34 to 39 in the woes against the scribes and the Pharisees. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, saying, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Thus you witness against yourselves that you are the sons of who murdered the prophets. Therefore I send you prophets, sages, and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town, so that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I tell you, all this will come upon this generation. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Unquote. Thank you. Matthew's conclusion here to the woes is as complicated as it is rich. Focusing on what is relevant to our discussion this evening, I'll say that he takes over a very early tradition that may actually go back to Jesus himself to speak about the persecution of teachers and prophets in his community, as well as Jesus's generation. There are traditions in the Hebrew Bible, such as the Elijah cycle in 1 Kings, the book of Amos, the book of Jeremiah, that speak of the persecution of prophets. Jeremiah 26 seems to be especially relevant for our purposes, including, as Raymond Brown says, the prophet's warning against the Jerusalem temple, the assemblage of priests and prophets against him, the participation of all the people, and the warning that they would bring innocent blood on themselves, and the contention that he deserved death. However, the theme of the martyr Abel is enlarged in the Second Temple period, as is the theme of the murder of prophets in texts such as Isaiah, in texts such as the martyrdom of Isaiah. And the tradition of the Maccabean martyrs looms large in the minds of the gospel writers. All of this is combined with traditions around martyred righteous people that appear in 1st Enoch, in 2 of the books of 1st Enoch, actually, suggesting that Matthew is using biblical and early Jewish traditions to describe, and maybe Jesus himself used these traditions, Matthew uses them to describe Jesus's life, death, and teachings. I would just add here that it's almost like a parenthesis, that Zechariah, who is the son of Barachiah, is a prophet. The Zechariah of Matthew is probably confused with the Zechariah of 2 Chronicles, chapter 24, who was actually murdered in the temple. Zechariah, the prophet, was not murdered. All of this resounds in the reading of chapter 27:25. Jesus's innocent blood is linked to the blood of the righteous blood that is called down on the scribes and Pharisees in chapter 23. In chapter 27, all the people call down that blood upon themselves and their children. There's a final reference to blood in Matthew's gospel, the Last Supper. The earliest tradition, which is found in 1 Corinthians, and that means the early 50s, indicates that by the 50s, Jesus's followers were associating the cup with the covenant and with Jesus's blood. The text reads, this cup is a new covenant in my blood. Matthew has, and can we look at the text here? Here we go. Matthew has, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. Chapter 26, verse 28. Thank you. The text looks back to the blood of the righteous, the prophets of Zechariah murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. But the blood of the covenant, all the people. Certainly the motif of persecution of the prophets occurs in chapter 27, verse 25, but all the people evokes links with Sinai and the covenant. The phrase is common in the Septuagint, and we think about the curses in Deuteronomy chapter 27, verses 15 to 26, as well as Exodus chapters 18 through 34, where the phrase occurs 20 times and so forth. Dramatically, we think about Exodus 24, verse 3. Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. The text continues. Moses wrote down all the words of the law. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and set up 12 pillars corresponding to the 12 tribes of Israel. He sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed oxen as offerings of well-being to the Lord. Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he dashed upon the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient. Moses took the blood and dashed it on the people and said, see the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words, unquote. This is Exodus chapter 24, verses 4 through 8. Matthew indeed may see chapter 27, verse 25 as an ironic play on the covenant reality enacted in the innocent blood of Jesus and setting the stage for the destruction of Jerusalem. Does Matthew believe that the opposition are no longer in a covenantal relationship with the God of Israel? I don't believe so. They are wrong-headed, they are hypocrites, and they are Jews. How do you hold that together? Well, we hold that together. It's not so hard. It's not so far-fetched. We think about our own communities. There are lots of people we think are wrong-headed. I'm talking as a Catholic here, bad Catholics, them, and they're Catholics. I know the Jewish community has the same reality. There are people who think those folks over there are wrong-headed, they are bad Jews, and they are Jews. So, and I think that may be going on here. These people are responsible, Matthew believes, for the death of Jesus and for the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. Jeremiah and other prophets believe that Jerusalem was destroyed because of her sin. Apocalyptic writers writing in Matthew's day believed that the second temple had been destroyed because of sin. And Josephus wrote that it was due to the infighting between Jewish groups that the war against Rome was inaugurated. The rabbis wrote similarly. They talk about the lack of charity, of chesed, among Jews. Matthew has a great deal of company in his hermeneutical task. He differs only in his specifying that the sin is the rejection and death of Jesus. Certainly, Matthew is aware of the presence of the empire as he goes about his task. He's fierce, partly because the stakes are high. He and his colleagues who are sent by wisdom are scribes trained for the great kingdom of heaven, according to chapter 13, verse 52. They are the ones who must interpret Torah for life in this new messianic era, inaugurated by Jesus, the kingdom of heaven. They are the ones who interpret correctly. They are the ones, I believe, they are the ones who believe that they know God's will. However, I also believe that the rhetoric is so fierce because Matthew's opponents may be winning over some of his community members. The opposition threatened his very authority as a scribe, as the authoritative teacher of the Jesus community. So what are we to do with this text? This text that has caused so much pain, that still can cause pain, that still continues to be misinterpreted in ways that can only be called hateful. I believe that all of us who teach and preach the gospel have a duty, a moral obligation to teach it in truth. I do not think we can shy away from the harshness, the challenge, the tragic history of this, or so many other texts that touch on sensitive issues. Think about texts that touch on gender, on human sexuality. One of the questions that Matthew's gospel poses to me is precisely the nature of rhetoric. This is very much a live issue in my own country, where civil society and church alike are polarized. In a way, we are not so very different here from those apocalyptic Jews or stoic and cynic sages who hurled insults, drawing boundaries tightly around our group. We are the real thing. Our group are the real Christians, the radical Christians. They are misled, to speak of it mildly. We think in terms of inside, outside, us, them, right, wrong. The question to me becomes, not only in terms of the Jewish-Christian dialogue, but in terms of our dialogue with one another as human beings, how do we walk the road together to find ways that lead to a new way of being together before the one God? Thank you. I've put, there's another text, a slide that Marco put up that has some suggestions for further reading. I would just say that the Jewish Annotated New Testament, especially the second edition, it's much expanded, is an excellent reference book for anything having to do with the New Testament. And the others are, the death of Jesus is 1994, so it is only minimally out of date. It continues to be a magnificent resource for plumbing these materials. John Campion's Matthew Within Sectarian Judaism is very, very helpful, and it's recent. Andrew Overman and Andy Overman's Church and Community in Crisis. It's 1990s, as is Saldarini's book, but they retain their value in studying this material. So, and they're easily available. So I would recommend them to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, for facilitating that playing of the wonderful recording. So let's just take a moment to pause and to have just a little time of quiet reflection on Celia's presentation, and just to allow yourself to think, what's going on for you? Is there a word or a phrase that's standing out for you? Perhaps a challenge to think a little differently. So let's just have a quiet moment. And so we just need to keep moving. Our time together this evening is a little shorter than perhaps would need for us to sit there and really reflect on Sister Celia's presentation. There's much for us to come back to in that presentation. So at the moment now, I'd like to introduce Father Chris Monaghan. Many of you will know Father Chris. Father Chris Monaghan is a Passionist priest and is currently serving as president at Yarra Theological Union. For many years, he has lectured at YTU in both First and Second Testament scripture studies. Over time, his work has focused particularly on Luke, Acts, the letters of Paul, and Matthew's Gospel. So he's well able to assist us this evening in furthering our understanding on the text regarding the Jews in Matthew's Gospel. And he's now going to offer us a response to the presentation.
Thanks very much, Carmel, and it's great to be with you, to be dealing with texts that are complex and challenging, and it's very clear that Celia's done a really lovely job for us in leading us into the richness of Matthew's traditions and context, and I'm sure there's a you to be trying to digest at this time. So what I'll try to do is just build on, complement what Celia's already done, admitting that in some areas, given they say between every 2 Jews you need 3 synagogues, well, in New Testament scholarship, this happens also. I'm not so convinced that Matthew is actually in the homeland. I think Matthew's a bit further north in Syria, but I'll explain that. But that won't be relevant really to our task and reflecting on this difficult text. So I'm going to share some screen just to make it a little bit easier for you to I suppose reinforce what you've already been hearing. So just in terms of Matthew's context, it's generally agreed that it is post-destruction of Jerusalem. Of course, this laid a challenge for the Jewish community. Was this punishment on God's part? Did it mean abandonment by God? It was clearly a time of great trauma and transition. And after the destruction of Jerusalem, questions of identity are pressing. The challenge to be faithful to a rich tradition in Judaism, but of opening up to the Gentiles. And to use Paul's language there from Romans in chapter 11, how are the Gentiles to be grafted in? Matthew uses well, not Matthew, but Paul uses the language of the olive tree to which the Gentiles have been grafted into the olive tree. So Celia had spoken about Torah observant Gentiles. I'm not quite sure how that was going to be accepted by other Jewish communities. And I think that's where Celia has really strongly pointed out the variation that was present within the Jewish homeland and broader, and as early Christianity developed. What were they going to make, what sort of sense were they going to make of themselves when they've got Jews and Gentiles? Yes, there were God-fearers. Yes, this is true, well and truly indicated to us by, if you read Acts of the Apostles, so often that's there. But how did these communities, how are they able to stay within the Jewish environment without being seen to be somewhat lessening their adherence to the tradition? And of course, they were adherent to Jesus, as Celia had said, Jesus' interpretation of Torah. So one of the things that Matthew does is that Matthew's gospel brings together many different streams of tradition, both Jewish and Gentile, and he holds them in a dynamic tension. So new wine and new wineskins need to be preserved, held together. This is unique to Matthew's gospel, not the wine and the wineskins, but the fact that Matthew interprets it that your new wine has to be put into new wineskins and both preserved, both held together. And I think this is a challenge for Matthew and Matthew's community. And as Celia highlighted, the Christian scribe of Matthew's gospel at the end of the parabolic discourse in chapter 13 is invited to bring out treasures both new and old. And I suppose this is the thing when we read Matthew about being observant to the Torah, Jesus will say in the beginning of the Sermon of the Mount that not one jot, not one tittle of the law will be taken away until all is fulfilled. And Jesus says, no one who abandons any of the least of these commandments will enter into the kingdom of heaven. But of course, what are these commandments? The ones that Jesus is talking about. It was impossible for Gentiles to be Torah observant in terms of purity code they could do. Are they going to be circumcised? In the light of Jesus' advent and Messiah, it does, as Messiah, it does change things radically. So one of the things that my work in Luke and Matthew has been in terms of the source critical work, looking quite closely at the sources that are drawn on and I suppose the voices that are held in a dynamic tension in Matthew's gospel and for Luke too. So one of the things I like about Matthew is that Matthew holds Jewish and Gentile voices together, doesn't eliminate them, gives them space to resonate. So Mark's gospel is written for a Gentile community, and this provides the framework that Matthew draws on in shaping Matthew's own gospel. Then there's materials unique to Matthew, some of which address questions of Jewish piety, almsgiving, prayer, fasting. We see this in chapter 6, in particular the first 18 verses of chapter 6 in the Sermon on the Mount, dealing with Jesus' interpretation of the Torah, new standard which is higher than the old. And another stream of tradition that Matthew draws on is from what we call Q. It's about 230 verses shared with Matthew and Luke, not found in Mark. And at least one of the strong streams within that tradition was of radical prophetic Jewish Christian evangelists. They're the hard line, the sort of materials that you'll have about the preaching of John the Baptist, you brood of vipers who warned you to flee from the wrath that is coming. Prepare for the coming of the Messiah, because even now the axe is at the root of the tree. So that was just a little bit of background. So the question that we ask, and any interpreter of Matthew would be looking at this. So why is a Jewish gospel the only one to include this horrific text when the people said, let his blood be on us and on our children? Then he released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. It's one of those dark mysteries, isn't it? What's this text doing here? If Matthew is so concerned right from the beginning of the gospel to show us that Jesus is son of David, son of Abraham, son of God, how could it be that this text would be included when it's not in Luke, it's not in John, it's not in Mark? So it leads us to look deeply, and we know it's been a text that has caused an enormous amount of pain and persecution and suffering for the Jewish people over centuries, something of which Christians should clearly be ashamed and ensure that it never happens again. So some of you may not be aware that in Pope Benedict's work in 2011 on his 3 volumes on the person of Jesus of Nazareth, he looked at this text and he explained biblically and theologically why there's no basis in scripture for the argument that the Jewish people as a whole and forever were responsible responsible for Jesus' death. In fact, dealing with that question of deicide, killing God. So as Benedict asked, how could the whole people have been present at this moment to clamour for Jesus' death? So he deconstructs one particular biblical account, which has the crowd saying, his blood be on us and on our children, a phrase frequently cited as evidence for the collective guilt the Jews bore and the curse that they have carried as a result. This was greeted by the Jewish community very positively, as you would imagine. So Rabbi Marvin here said, as I told His Holiness during our November 2005 meeting at the Vatican, prior to Nostra Aetate, Jews were often held in contempt and derided as an accursed people. Millions suffered through the ages because there were none to defend them. The Second Vatican Council's Nostra Aetate declared that this was a false teaching and absolved the people as a collective from the crime of deicide. So the Pope's new book goes beyond this declaration, shows why the earlier popular reading is not supported by the gospel texts, a really important step. And so important that we had a Pope declaring it in our times. So the question I'd like to lead you to reflect on when we come to Matthew's Gospel, who is responsible for the death of Jesus? Is it the Jewish authorities? Is it the crowd? Is it Rome? Is it more? So some facts that we need to keep in mind. That yes, it's true that Jesus does die under Roman law under the charge of sedition. And it's important to remember when we read Matthew's Gospel, as in the other Gospels, that the religious elite clearly challenged by Jesus' interpretation of Torah. And the passion predictions keep the reader's attention on them, the scribes, the Pharisees, the leaders, time and time again, as Matthew inherited from Mark, the passion predictions, Matthew places them in Matthew's narrative context as well. It's important to know from a historical point of view that both Pilate, the high priest, and Herod, they were all Roman appointees. And an alignment of these elements against Jesus was not unlikely. As Celia pointed out, Caiaphas and Pilate were in cahoots for some time, and Caiaphas's family maintained their position as high priests, as Roman appointees, clearly because they maintained Roman order and Roman interests as well as Jewish interests. And I suppose that gives for us that confidence in that line that you hear in John's Gospel, that it's fitting for one person to die for the people. It's expedient that this should happen. And that's exactly the sort of thing you would expect someone who's desperately trying to hold on to power for his own family to say. On this slide, of course, some of you will be quite familiar with this. This is from the Arch of Titus in Rome, just near the Colosseum. And you'll see this arch was built to commemorate the completion of the Roman domination of putting down of the Jewish revolt. And you'll see the seventh branch candlestand and menorah and incense vessels being brought to Rome in their triumph. So the thing is, it is true. Matthew cannot forget. Matthew's writing for a community of Christians, be they Jewish Christians, all of them have to live in the Roman Empire. And this has to, I think, colour the portrait of Pilate and the Roman authorities. And when we read the Gospels, just think about the ways the centurions are portrayed and the faith that they're described as having. There are plenty of texts in Acts of the Apostles that would be worth exploring here as well. But you know, the tradition that's there within Matthew and Mark, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. And if you're looking at the letters of Paul, say in Romans 13, written in the 50s, there's the call for Roman Christians to submit to legitimate authority, be they Jewish or Gentile. So while I've got a little bit of time with you, I'd like to extend Matthew's invitation to go deeper than assigning blame and guilt to Roman authorities or Jewish authorities or the crowd, because my understanding is what will help to unlock the mystery is actually to enter into the mind and heart of God and Jesus. One of the things that we see when we look at Matthew's gospel is Jesus' first words are there when he encounters John the Baptist at his baptism. And John the Baptist says, look, I should be baptized by you. And Jesus gives him this enigmatic response. He says, no, what we've got to do is fulfill all righteousness. And remember what Celia said about that play on innocence and righteousness? Well, being righteous, the chaos, is going to be a golden thread that goes all through the narrative of Matthew. Think about the Sermon on the Mount as being one keynote address, an exposition on the demands of faith, how to be in right relationship with God and Jesus and one another. So one of the ways that Matthew teases out this idea of being in right relationship is this fascinating use of this text from Hosea. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I've come to call not the righteous, but sinners. So see also Matthew 12:7. This is God's stance towards humanity. And I think this is the broader context in which we have to understand this text of terror that we have in Matthew 27. Because it's not about a God who is there to condemn. It's about a God who is here to save. And isn't it fascinating to see that this phrase, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, is repeated. It's the only text I'm aware of in the New Testament, in the Gospels, that is used twice as a way into Jesus' own self-understanding and appreciation of the God that he calls us to be in relationship. One of the unique things about Matthew's Gospel is the way that Matthew invites us into the mind and discernment of Jesus. While all the Gospels, all the Synoptic Gospels will have the passion predictions that form a framework as leads the reader and the disciples towards Jerusalem and Jesus' fate there. One of the things that Matthew does very, very subtly is to lead us to see how closely aligned Jesus' mission is to God's will. And he does this in a very subtle way through drawing our attention to what is Jesus' response to John the Baptist's arrest and then subsequent death. So in other words, showing us that Jesus' awareness of, gosh, if I proclaim this message, what can happen to me? So Jesus is not a rabbit caught in the headlights. Jesus conforms himself to this deep, deep invitation. So this is unique to Matthew. Now, when Jesus heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew to Galilee. And we wonder in this pause, what's going on? What's going to happen? What will Jesus do? The very next thing that Jesus does is he comes out and proclaims the same message about the kingdom that John had. He's taken up the baton. He's going to take this rocky road. He's going to run with this message of the kingdom. And when John the Baptist has been killed and Jesus hears about this, what's his response then? Because the ante has been upped, hasn't it? But now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. And when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. Jesus wants to withdraw, but what happens? The people follow him. He is invited once again to his deep mission to care for them, to carry their burdens, to cure their sick. And he responds with love and compassion and healing. So throughout the narrative, as we've already mentioned, the reader is prepared for Jesus' death. Passion predictions reveal that Matthew wants to show Jesus' awareness and commitment to travel this road. And also Jesus' actions in Jerusalem, in the city, as the city prepares for the national feast of liberation. It was a time when the Roman authorities would bring in extra troops. There were often riots at this time. So Jesus comes to Jerusalem at precisely this moment. He enters the city as a king. He goes to the royal sanctuary. He confronts the Jewish authorities and silences them by his wisdom. Surely Jesus knows what's before him. Surely Jesus continues to give himself. There's a deeper logic than Jewish authorities, Roman authorities, crowds, or even the disciples. Interesting enough, in Matthew, the Passion narrative begins with a solemn pronouncement by Jesus. It's when Jesus has given this pronouncement to his disciples that the Passion is coming. It's at that moment that the Jewish authorities then plot to bring about Jesus' demise. It's almost with Jesus' permission. Jesus is not powerless in Matthew's Passion narrative. He could have legions of angels, a text unique to Matthew, legions of angels to protect him, but this is not his fate. This is not his journey. This is not his mission. So Matthew places Jesus' death within a long tradition, and Celia has pointed out some of this for us, the Psalms of the suffering righteous, which shape the very way that the narrative is told. The gall, the Father forgive them, not no Father forgive them, that's another text, that's from Luke, but the whole idea of my God, why have you abandoned me? Psalm 22, the suffering righteous, and Celia pointed out the rejected prophets of the Deuteronomic historian, where God keeps sending prophets and people don't accept the wisdom that God is offering. Yeah, this is within Jewish circles, and the Maccabean martyrs. But unlike the Maccabean martyrs who curse the one who is going to take their life, we hear about the sons and the mother and their bravery. Jesus doesn't do that. If anything, he is more like another figure, a figure known well to us, that of the suffering servant. And Matthew will twice within the narrative highlight that Jesus is that suffering servant. When he's healing, there's a whole cycle of miracles in chapters 8 and 9 that follow Jesus' power in word in chapters 5 to 7, and then his power in deed, assembling all these miracle stories. But what happens then, right at that moment, Matthew reminds us this was to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took our infirmities and bore our diseases. Matthew 12, here is my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved, with whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice, righteousness, being dikaios, to the Gentiles. He will not wrangle or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. He will not break a bruised reed or quench a smouldering wick until he brings justice, dikaiosune, to victory. God's being in right relationship with us, a relationship to do something for us that we cannot do for ourselves. So as I say, Jesus' death is ultimately not about Jewish guilt, Roman power, or Judas' betrayal, because Jesus gives his life as a ransom for many. In the Last Supper, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. So actually the language of guilt is not really appropriate to what Matthew is trying to say. Because in Jesus, in this extraordinary gift of Jesus' death as the suffering servant, by his wounds, we, all of us, Jew and Gentile, are healed. In the garden, Jesus puts the Our Father into practice. My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. And Matthew makes sure that we hear the resonance of the prayer that Jesus teaches disciples in the Sermon on the Mount. So ultimately, this is Jesus' gift. There is no condemnation of Israel. Jesus' death is for all. It's a gift that's more important than assigning guilt. God's stance towards our wounded humanity was, is, and always will be one of love. So it's very pleasing to see then what had been said by Benedict is now being reinforced by Pope Francis in Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel. We hold the Jewish people in special regard because their covenant with God has never been revoked. Taking the words from Paul, for the gifts and the call of God are irrevocable. God is always in right relationship with us. We've got to learn to be in right relationship with each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for that wonderful, rich input that really helped further our understanding of Celia's presentation. I think just given the time we have left together, what we might do is again pause for a moment and just think back over the two presentations that you've had this evening and to think about what is arising in you. What are the presentations asking of you? And let's just have a couple of minutes to do that. And then at the end of our little reflection time, Chris, if you're okay, we'll just have time probably for a couple of questions. So
yeah, no problem.
Just a couple of moments of reflection, and then we'll be able to take a couple of questions. So if you do have a question, please pop it into the chat facility, and Anna and Mark will help us work through some of those. So if there's anyone who has a question, what we'll ask you to do, given that we have such a large number of people with us this evening, is to just type your question into the chat facility.
Mary Rayburn, Cecilia spoke about words enacting what we say. Could Matthew have intended or foreseen that this blood curse would be enacted throughout the centuries up until the time of the Holocaust? Please comment.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think that Matthew sees this blood curse to be given the fact that Jerusalem has been destroyed, and given that Israel had often interpreted events that occurred that were either exile or dislocation in different ways, as they saw it within the context of God punishing God's people. So it was within the people themselves. So I think it's right to highlight that it's the crowd in Jerusalem. So why put the burden on the crowd? Well, Matthew's Christians, as did contemporary Jews, just had to say, well, what happened to us? How come this happened? And so Matthew would never ever have envisaged that what was seen to be a way of talking about just Jerusalem at that time and the people who asked for Jesus' death. That's all it was. That was all it was saying. They would never ever have understood or expected that it would have led to what it has. Absolutely. No question about that.
Thanks, Chris. And we've got another question here. How important is it to teach Nostra Aetate in schools today, parishes and seminaries, to combat anti-Semitism?
Yeah, look, I think everything that we can do to actually highlight to people what our tradition has in fact said. Unfortunately, many people, and that's not just kids, it's adults, it's seminaries, we need to rediscover what our tradition already has said, because sadly, all too often people are ignorant of what our tradition. It's misguided often. They just don't know. And when we come to Good Friday, it's always this. It's always a dangerous time for us, isn't it?
Can I just make a quick comment, Chris, please?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Michael Dillon, you taught me at YTU, the Gospel
Hi,
of
Michael.
Luke. Hi. I also feel that the conservative and traditional Catholics still have not accepted Nostra Aetate or anything from Vatican II. I know particularly like the SSPX, Society of Pius XII, they still regard the Jews as an accursed race, and they also write in their documents that Nostra Aetate is a modernist document that shouldn't be, adhered to at all. And, that's where you get the anti-Semitism spreading with younger people as well, that they teach.
Sure, and this is also true when you've got people who are prefer an older liturgy, pre-revised liturgy that will have pretty horrendous prayers about the Jewish people. So that's certainly all dangerous. There's just as an aside, look, modernism was something that happened at the beginning of the 1900s, and yet so often it's used as a grab bag for. It's an umbrella that you can put just about anything you don't like into, and it's modernism. Historically, that's absolutely it's disingenuous to actually do that. And I've heard some bishops using it that way, and that's been all I could, not to just had to stand on my hands and not, or sit on my hands and not stand up to stop myself from just sort of saying, oh, excuse me, that's just intellectually wrong. It's not accurate, and you shouldn't be saying it.
Thank you for that, Chris. I think Anna
we've got
just
time for one more, or
I think we might just about need to wrap it up there. Thank you, Anna, just so that we can finish on time.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's right. Look, people can always email me if you've got messages, you could send it to me, and I'm happy to respond. Okay, no problem.
Thanks very much for that. Very generous offer, Chris. That's a way that we can actually get to a couple more questions, have you answer them directly. So thank you very much.
There was a lot of input there, a massive amount of input.
There was, yes. And so we've kind of thrown lots at people and a very rich input that they'll just need to take some time themselves to unpack and to reflect on over the next little while. So just to wrap up our evening tonight, I was thinking today when I was just getting ready to host this with you all this evening that one of the things that I was once told by a wonderfully wise Irish sister I worked with was that you cannot unsee what your eyes have beheld, nor unhear what you've heard. And it was reminding me that, as I suspected we would this evening, we've been treated to some wonderfully rich input. So our eyes have heard, and our eyes have seen, and our ears have certainly heard a lot that we can bring to our next reading of Scripture around how we understand the Jews in Matthew's Gospel. Firstly, Sister Celia's wonderful presentation. And secondly, thank you, Chris, for the inspiring and engaging way you've assisted us in furthering our understanding about how to approach these difficult texts this evening. So our sincere thanks to you, and we'll give you what amounts to a virtual applause these days. And thank you most sincerely for taking the time to be with us tonight. And finally, just to thank all those who've assisted us in organising this seminar tonight, which, as we said earlier, has been sponsored by the Jewish Christian Relations team of the Sisters of Our Lady of Sion. And our special thanks to Mark Walsh for his technical expertise this evening, holding all of this together, screens, live chat, questions and answers, all sorts of things going on, including an early morning recording session with Sister Celia Deutsch. So we're very grateful to you, Mark, for your expertise and work around this. And to Anna for her backup and assistance tonight with the technical side of things, and also for gaining accreditation for us for this seminar tonight. And finally, thanks to Garratt Publishing for their assistance in promoting the event broadly throughout our parishes and the people who are on their mailing lists. So we're very grateful for that. Just to let you know that a recording of the session will be available on our YouTube channel. And last of all, thanks to all of you for being with us this evening, for joining us for what has been a wonderful, inspiring and thought-provoking seminar. And I wish you all a very good evening.